The Zinda art and karate war have been going on for well over a millennia now. No side ever seems to really have an advantage over the other, yet they still continue to fight over reasons we don't even know anymore. If you ask either side, they will simply say that the feud has been going on too long and there's too much blood. One side must die for the river of blood to stop flowing, or some such nonsense. If you don't even know what you're fighting for, why are you fighting? We did pose this question when they first came to our planet. You see, we were way, way outside their territory. And though we had only settled 2 sectors, we figured there was no way they would come to us. There was no way the war would reach this far, as they were too busy killing themselves over their own planets. But we were wrong. When they first came down, the Karates came down with such vengeance, starting to take any resources they could. We thought the Zentate would end up treating us better. But no, they treat us just as horribly. One side, a very strong reptilian creature. Ones who would simply slash at you with their claws and rip you asunder if you ever questioned anything they told you to do, or if you tried to stop them from hurting one of your own. And then you have the wonderful Zindahare, which only talk through clicks and whistles and are more hive mind than anything else. They move mechanically and simply will take anything from you, including your own life, if you're simply in the way. It didn't matter which side you wanted to stay on. All we could do was run and hide and hope that they got tired with our planet as we were so far away from their home system. But no, of course not. They didn't even consider holding back. They didn't even think, well, we'll just give them this planet and focus on another one. No, as far as they were concerned, this was a new battle line. And they began to tear each other asunder. One clawing at the other, another spiking at the other one. Barely using any type of projectile weapons made everything rather gruesome. Fortunately for us, that left a lot of materials for us to eat, as there was not much left. Both sides were stripping our fields bare of anything edible. Our trees that used to bear lavish fruits were now torn apart, as each side would try to deny each other resources. It was horrible. Throughout this entire solar cycle, we tried our best. What the humans or anyone else would call a year. We tried our best to survive. And we managed for a while. It wasn't so bad. Hiding in whatever caves, whatever holes we could find, anyone on the surface would immediately be viewed as an enemy and either slaughtered or took as some sort of meat shield or slave, or if you're really unlucky, living food. Both sides had no problems chewing on us, even though we were larger than them, standing almost 2 standard meters. Yet, even though we were so thin, it didn't matter. They simply looked at us as a new resources for them to take. The next cycle around the sun was even worse. Resources became more and more scarce, and each side began to dig in, and as they did, every once in a while they would find our caves, our bunkers, rip into them thinking it was an enemy fortification. They would find nothing but families inside, trying to hold out long enough that each side would get tired or simply kill each other off. But no, each side, every time they found one of the bunkers, they would simply strip it for resources. And of course, those living inside were a resource. The Karates were more interested in those slaves being alive, while the Ta'ade were more interested in feasting on what they found. So it was either you were living food, at least not for long though, as you got back to their lines where they would rip you to pieces, sometimes very slowly, just to savor the meal. Or you were forced into slavery where you were forced to do things that were more than abhorrent. Many times it was simply bringing food or bringing supplies up, but you would not be able to feed unless they fed you. If you were caught eating something that they did not give you, they simply took it from you and then broke your hand several times and then forced you back to work. Many of our people starved. Many of our people were eaten. Many of our people were beaten, ripped apart, slaughtered in front of us, and there wasn't anything we could do. Our species was not a predatory one. Though we were the dominant species on our planet, that was simply because almost every other species had plenty of resources for them to consume. Around our planet, birth rates are considered extremely low by galactic standards, especially compared to an insectoid race that can birth several hundred every single day from a single female. Whether or not they survive to term, that's another story altogether. But it was more and more devastating as more and more of our people were taken, forced into slaves, or forced to sit there and watch as their brethren were chewed into nothing, bones snapping in half inside an insectoid maw or going down a reptilian gullet, waiting simply for their turn to be picked up and chewed on by several others as you scream in panic and pain as they began to rip flesh from your body. One thing that was even most horrible to us was the fact that our tails, though not very large, seemed to be a delicacy, and it seemed to be something those would fight over. It was well known that any that were able to escape were always missing their tails, as very soon they were bitten off. So we tried to stay hidden, surviving on roots that we could find. Small hydroponics we figured out how to operate. Were able to keep many of us from starving to death, but we were still on starvation rations ourselves. Our planet was being ravaged on the surface, barely able to keep itself from complete and total collapse. So we made a desperate plea. We created a transmitter. We got it close enough to the surface where it could blast out a single pulse, a single message out to the stars on the tachyon band, something that would reach several sectors in a matter of hours. A simple message, along with showing our plight, a simple request. Help us, please. As soon as we sent the pulse, both sides came down on us like vultures onto a fresh kill. It was insane that they would simply go at each other just to destroy this one small piece of equipment. Though I wouldn't say it was quite small. It was about the size of one of our domiciles. But it was enough that each side lost hundreds of thousands of their own just for the honor of destroying it. And all we could do was sit there in our caves, hope, and pray that some species out there would have heard, some species would come to help us. And for another cycle and a half, there was nothing. It was getting so bad that many of our young were barely able to reach adolescence before they starved to death. Many men starved themselves out trying to ration their food enough for their families. The mothers would ration themselves down to nothing for their children, and the older children would try to ration enough for the younger. It was all they could do just to keep them alive. And at this point, I was barely even 10 cycles old. A child, a young child, barely able to move around. It was requested that we not move around much. My parents were already gone, taken by either side. I don't know which, nor do I care. I just wanted out of this nightmare that we lived in. Each day, we prayed to what great maker there may be that someone would hear us, someone would come and help us. And as reports from the surface came back that both sides seemed to be pulling back as the planet itself had been drained of a few of its particular resources, in particular certain metals they were digging up. Both sides were beginning to leave. But as we started to climb out of our bunkers and out of our caves, we did so hesitantly, as we did not know what may still be there. And thankfully, as I saw the sky and our star for the first time, I felt its warmth, and I saw a shuttle leaving. I was told it was a Akrates. They were finally leaving this area. Their enemy had already left. The planet was of no use to them. They simply wanted this material. For what, we don't know. But all we knew was we were glad they were gone. But what we saw on the surface was just as bad as underneath. Most of the vegetation was gone. All of the fauna had been stripped out. If we did not try to raise it ourselves, we had a few strands of DNA. But that was it. There was nothing left for us there. And at that point, I saw many of those that had seen the invasion and watched their friends get torn apart and consumed by the two armies that seemed to not want to stop the war, but simply wanted to keep it going. I saw them all break down. I was too young, and my body too frail. I sat there on the ground as the sun faded away and came up the next morning, and then faded again the next night. I remember looking up to the stars, as a few had actually found some small remnants of food that we could eat. It wasn't much, but it may keep us alive for a little longer. But I wondered what was the point. As I hold that little small morsel in my hand, it was barely the size of my hand. And we looked up and we saw, it seemed like a meteor shower. And we all prayed. We raised what little food we had, and all claimed that we would sacrifice even this, what little we had, if someone would come and save us. Someone could possibly help us. I was awake that night as I heard some strange noise reaching out. It was odd. It was a rumble in the sky. I awoke and everyone was out and looking around. I asked what was going on. They were confused. This sounded like something they called thunder. I had heard of this. But I asked, didn't this come with clouds? And there was not a single one in the sky. They stated, yes, this was true. But what was that? There was other stars in the sky. They were stars that we had not noticed before. And it wasn't long before a few started crying and screaming, they're back, oh no, they're back. As we saw these lights get closer and closer and closer and larger. But they weren't coming directly onto us, they were just getting close. But what were these? A few of the older ones were screaming, they've come back to take us all. They've come to kill us all off after all this. And I started to cry. I dropped down again to my knees. And I reached out and prayed to whatever beings might be out there. Why would you do this to us? What has our species done to you? And as I looked up, I could see not just those stars that got larger, but I could see small little stars coming out from all sides. I was confused. What was this? These small stars seemed to be coming to the surface. Did the star burst or something? More and more of these. 2, 20, 50. From each side of these, now what I could see were ships. These weren't stars, these were ships, and there was something else coming down. Small lights were coming down, but there wasn't just one light. Seemingly one or two were flickering in the night. The sun was beginning to rise as we saw these lights almost fade in, as we saw these ships finally make it to the surface. Out in the distance, we saw huge plumes of smoke. It seemed as though they had burned the ground as they landed, but also there was a huge cloud of dust as well. And then I finally saw them. These things seemingly flying through the air, seemingly jumping from one building to another, all spread out, waving their arms at each other, saying something in a language I did not know. I just stayed there on my knees. I couldn't move. I had nothing left to me. And one of these things finally came down from the top of a building and landed right in front of me. It was shaped kind of like us. 2 legs, 2 arms, but I couldn't see much else past that solid white of its outer shell. I thought another insectoid race had come to chew on me, but I had nothing left. I couldn't cry. I couldn't scream. I had no anything left in me. I had no will. I just sat there and waited for it to come, open its maw and take me. But it walked up. It got down on a knee, looked at me, held up its hand, and a strange light came out of it and seemed to go over me. And then suddenly it pulled something off of its side. It seemed like something came from its back, and then it reached out to touch me. It touched my face. It caressed my ear and then my horns. What is this thing doing? It looked over and another set of lights came from the other hand. What was it doing? And I felt calm. I felt relief. It then pulled something out. Some strange, flexible thing with a cord that it punched into it. It was strange. It was almost like there was a liquid inside. It's the way it moved. It simply grabbed this, and there was a small piece of metal sticking out on his suit. I realized it was a suit, as the piece of metal on the side seemed to pop out without it saying anything, and then it hung this piece of liquid on there. It reached out, grabbed my arm, and then squeezed the top of my arm, and then let go suddenly. And then squeezed again, but not quite as hard. It looked and I could see the little bit of my blood veins sticking out. And then I looked to see what it was doing with the other hand. It was somehow opening up a small piece of metal. I was wondering what this was. Maybe it was going to poison me. Is it going to preserve me for a snack later? It reached with a little piece of metal and I felt a small pinch as I saw a little bit of my own blood enter up. Slowly, very slowly. And then it pushed it farther in and then withdrew a little piece out, which was strange. And then it reached up to the end of that tube that was there, popped off the end, and then shook it until a little piece of fluid came out. Still holding onto my arm, it seemed to use its other hand with extreme precision and put the end of that tube into the piece of metal that was there. Once it was connected, it released its hand on top of my arms, and I felt a cool sensation go up into me. And suddenly, I was feeling so much better. It reached around and grabbed some sort of adhesive, and it wrapped it around my arm, holding this tube that was in my arm in place. As I looked up, I suddenly realized that I wasn't nearly as thirsty as I was anymore. I was confused. What was it doing? I looked and I could see there were strange bubbles going back up into this thing. It reached up and grabbed the bag with its hand and squeezed, and I could feel more fluid going into my system. And it did so while holding the side of my head with its other hand. It was strange. It was like it was preparing for me to pass out, and I suddenly felt dizzy, a little dizzy, and started to lean over. It caressed my head and held me, slowly lowering my body to the ground so that I was laying down. And at that point, I could see another one come over and talk to it in, again, that strange language we couldn't understand. And then it looked to me, and then looked to the one that had been treating me, and simply walked away. Went to another one of my kind and did the same dance I saw it do on me. It was strange. What were they doing? What were these things anyway? These were not the invaders before. How could they do this? Why would they do this? And that is when this creature that had attached something to me reached up to what I found out was a helmet and raised the protective mask in front of it, and I laid eyes on this thing for the first time. Those strange purplish gray eyes that it had looked at me. The pale skin was almost the same color that it had on this shell that it wore, and it growled at me, but it didn't make any noise. It simply exposed its front teeth. I thought for sure it was going to eat me at this point. Then it reached over onto its chest and it started turning something, and I heard a click. And then it spoke in its own language that I did not understand. And then it suddenly came with my language with a very mechanical voice and said, "Don't worry, child. I've got you." And with that was the first time I was able to actually cry. As I now had fluid into my body, I realized what it was doing. They had come to save us. I looked over and I could see that some of them were already handing these small little things that our people could eat. We didn't understand it at first until we saw them tear the covering off and push it up, exposing this strange brown something. When our people didn't take it, this creature actually pulled its helmet off, exposing itself to our atmosphere. I know this could be bad for something that doesn't live here. So I worried for a moment, and then it simply took a bite off the end, chewed it up the same as we do, and then handed it over to my aunt. She nibbled at it, and then she consumed the entire thing. This seemed to make the creature scared as it started to wave its arms, saying a strange word over and over again. We didn't know why. And then it simply put its helmet back on and hit something on the side and then say something very loudly into its communication device. We didn't know what that was. All I knew is our angels had come to save us. Our prayers had been answered. And I finally relaxed, looking up into those strange eyes as again it exposed its teeth as it still checked me over to make sure I was okay. And I fell asleep knowing finally they've come, our angels.